Well, first, I want to express my gratitude that you honored me by asking me to be one of the speakers for this series. Once I became a little more acquainted with it, I have to say that it's exactly, I think, what is needed, and it's a major piece of the force that is making the change in the Catholic Church and in our society in general. It doesn't happen by itself. It happens because of courageous people. I'm also really honored in a way that you probably didn't expect, and that's because I'm honored because you're all from my favorite country on this planet, Scotland. And I mean, most of you are. I know there's some from elsewhere over there, but I've been to Scotland many times. I've been to I decided in honor of the situation, I'd wear the rugby shirt that I purchased last time I was at the Edinburgh Tattoo, which was about 5 years ago now, I think. And I'm hoping to get over there again soon. I first went to Scotland in, I think, 1990 something, when I was stationed in Germany in the Air Force, and I was told that I could get a flight from Frankfurt to I think Glasgow for £7 or €7. I didn't know where I was going, but I took the flight anyway, and it was a blessing because I've had nothing but wonderful, wonderful experiences, and I think I've been in just about every inch of the country except in the northernmost islands, northernmost Shetland. I've been in the southern ones, but not way up north. Okay, now let me stop talking about myself. Mary mentioned I've been involved in this for 37 years, 1984, and it's been constant. People have asked me, do I plan on retiring? And the question is, I don't even bother thinking about it because it can't happen. And it can happen partly because of my own commitment and because I know from my experience that this issue that we're dealing with, which is it's not a crisis, it's far bigger than that. It's not just a problem, a crisis. It is a phenomena. It is the manifestation, I think, of the very dark, dark side of the institutional Catholic Church that manages to manifest itself every so many years. And it certainly has manifested itself in spades with this issue. Why can't I retire? Partly because of my commitment, but partly because the issue that we're dealing with is not going to go away until the institution or the system that has created it and that has nourished it and protected it for hundreds and a couple thousand years is no longer doing that. And when that system is radically changed, its values, its culture, then we will begin to see a change in this terrible nightmare that we've been dealing with. And it's not just, I think the most vivid symptom of the corruption and the abuse is the violation of the innocent sexually and then spiritually as well. But it's a symptom of a much broader type of abuse. And I think that is rooted in the nature of the institution itself. Pope Pius X wrote an encyclical in 1908 called Vehementer Nos. That's Latin, for those of you who didn't know that. It was an encyclical written in which he said that there are two layers, two strata of people in the Catholic Church. The sacred pastors, that's the bishops, and then the laity, that's us, the rest of us. And that our duty is to be docile and to obey the sacred pastors and let them run the show. Well, we've seen how well that's worked out, not just in our own era, and I say our own era meant the 20th century, the 21st century, but throughout history. Even a very light study of non-revisionist history, I mean, that's honest church history, and that's something none of us got when we were in school. A non-revisionist history of the institution reveals that abuse and corruption, in many, many ways, has been embedded in the essence of the institution, in the essence. And by essence is the very being of the institution that we call the institutional Catholic Church. And the church, as it was defined, or as we were reminded in the wonderful document from the Second Vatican Council, Lumen Gentium, is the body of Christ, the people of God. And it doesn't say it's the bishops of God or the clergy of God or the hierarchy of God. It said it's the people of God. And they didn't qualify who these people were. So that's us. That's the well, far more than 99% of those who call themselves Catholic. But the institution and the structures, the government, the legal structures, the system itself is the institution that we see. When someone says, what's the first thing comes to your mind when you hear the word church? I've asked this question when I've given talks, large groups, small groups. Often they'll say they think of men with fancy robes on, the hierarchy, or they think of church buildings, they think of the clergy, nuns, brothers, and so on. But they don't think, first off, of this 2.15 billion people in the world who are officially part of the people of God. And I think unofficially, it's probably just about anybody God has created, whether you're religious or not. So the people of God is the essence, the meaning of what we call church. But there's a major, major problem, and there's a breakdown in the understanding that the people of God is not equal to the governmental structure. The governmental structure of the institutional Catholic Church is not the whole church at all, by any means. The body of Christ, the people of God, will continue to function, continue to do what they do, to love each other, to help each other, without all the structures. If canon law were suddenly obliterated, we'd survive. We'd muddle through. We'd keep calm and carry on, as they say. Now, the essence of the message of Jesus, the essential message, which is supposed to be the essence of the institution, it's not always been successful. I mean, the word of Christ in the Gospels and all the teachings and the fancy words of the bishops and the cardinals and the popes and so on, it's fallen on a lot of deaf ears. So we can think of a few rather horrific examples. The Crusades, not exactly something we can be proud of. The Inquisition, definitely not something we can be proud of. And then more recently, the collaboration between the Vatican, which is the headquarters of the institutional church, and in their mind, the headquarters of the body of Christ, the collaboration between the Vatican and the dictators of a number of countries. This was especially notorious during the Second World War, collaboration between the Vatican and Mussolini's government, and the Vatican and the Nazi government, and it was there. They granted them diplomatic relations. So sexual violation goes hand in hand with physical and spiritual abuse. And I've had conversations with more survivors, and victims than I can count. Most of them have said the worst pain, the worst abuse, when they finally realized what was really going on in their psyche and their soul, was the spiritual abuse that they had suffered, the rejection, the lying by the people that they had given everything to, that they had, really believed that these men walked on water and spoke for God, and then all this is shattered when they're lied to about something that is as horrific as being violated sexually. So this has been going on since the beginning of the church as a disorganized and non-organized gathering of groups of people who followed the message of Jesus, the infant church, the primitive church, And then it's been going on certainly since the Catholic Church was, so to speak, organized by Constantine, who gave official recognition to this growing body of believers because it was politically advantageous to him. Prior to that time, there's documented evidence that this issue was a problem. There's a document called the Didache, which is in English known as the Teaching of the 12 Apostles, which was discovered in the end of the 19th century, and it's dated from about 98 AD. And it was called, it was just a very short thing that was drawn up by the original leaders in the church, what was expected of people if they were going to be a follower of Christ. They weren't called Christians, they weren't called Catholics. I don't know what they called themselves, but they did know enough that they had to have some rules, some norms about following Christ. So in this document, it says very, very clearly, second chapter, that men, the elders, shall not lie sexually with young boys, period, end of story. Clear as a bell. This dates from 98. Now, the first, excuse me, that's my phone ringing. I thought I turned it off, but I didn't. The first actual law against any form of sexual abuse of minors, and they singled out minor boys because they were the major targets in that period, dates from the year 309. Now, since then, the evidence or the proof of this vile form of corruption is in the ecclesiastical documentation itself. It's in the official church's own documents. I've done a significant amount of research because it's something I do to try to find the answers, why this nightmare has happened. And the answers are in the essence of the churches. The answers are. So harmful sexual behavior in itself is not so much a church problem because that's part of the human condition. But how we respond to people who've been violated, what we do to prevent it from happening, that is a church problem. How violations, the violated have been treated by the hierarchy and the clergy, that is a problem for the people of God and for the institutional Catholic Church. That problem has existed since the church was first recognized officially in the beginning of the 4th century, and it still exists. It's not gone. It's not gone. Every now and then, a hierarch, a bishop or a cardinal will say, well, it's all over, it's finished. The problem is taken care of because we have made it safer for children to exist in the Roman Catholic Church. Well, wait a minute now, time out, Bishop. That's not true. It's not over, and it is not going to be over. And it's not over because the people, the millions of people who were so viciously violated and whose souls were tromped asunder by the institution, they're out there, they're hurting, they're not healing quickly on their own. And especially if any of these people had the audacity to question the institution in one of the court systems, the American court system, Canadian, whatever. You go to court, which is the only place where you're going to get true satisfaction and recognition, you are immediately turned into the enemy. And every force that they have will be brought against you. Now I see that day and night, time and time again. So all of the nice words of, we're so sorry that this happened, we just didn't understand, we're on a steep learning curve, that's a lot of nonsense. Any adult male that says he didn't realize that the sexual abuse of a child by an adult is not harmful is either a consummate liar, an idiot, or both. Because it's in, it's in the human condition. So this issue, as I said, is rooted in the condition itself, in the church itself. there's always been a clash of values at the bottom of all of it, serious clash. The Christian-based values, the values we inherited from Christ, from his example, from his words in the Gospels, of human dignity, of equal justice, compassion for the hurting, and think about the Gospels just for a moment. For me, always the most impressive, miraculous things that Christ did were not changing a bunch of barrels of water into wine, things like that, but things like reaching out to the Samaritan woman, who was, an outcast from the rest of society, reaching out to the woman caught in adultery, forgiving the people that turned their backs on him. That's the example. That's the message right there of unquestioning love. But that message has not always been apparently at the root of the value system that the institution has been driven by. I remember from my own training that one of the scripture classes I had, we were taught that the most important person in the church, and this is in the institutional church too, is the one who's the most rejected, the most hurting, and the most in need of love. And usually it's one of the most unattractive people, but they're the ones that if Jesus were here, he'd reach out to. And the old question that was very popular several years ago, what would Jesus do? That's a good question. It's something we need to keep asking ourselves. But these values, unfortunately, have been constantly challenged by the core value that has fueled the constant systemic nightmare of child and adult sexual violation by clerics and non-ordained religious, nuns and brothers. And that value is the protection of the image, the prestige, the power, and the economic resources of the governmental system, the hierarchical system. Now, we've all been led to believe that God himself, through Jesus Christ, presented this governmental model to St. Peter, and from the beginning of the church has always wanted it to be hierarchical, where it's a stratified society with an aristocracy, a tiny aristocracy at the top, running the whole show, and then the rest of us down at the bottom. Now, if you look at the numbers, the clerics in the Catholic Church constitute 0.0000031%. That's not much. If you look at the positions of power, these are the positions of the men who actually call the shots. Not every bishop, a lot of them are retired auxiliaries. It comes to about just under 3,000 men who run the Catholic Church. They're all bishops. None of them have been married, presumably. Certainly none of them have been parents, presumably, because if they'd been parents, this whole show would not have played down the way it has. Because if they'd been parents, they would understand clearly the horror of what is happening to children. And just imagining if this was happening to my child, but it's happening to other people's. So the mantra we often hear, the good of the church, we do this for the good of the church. Policemen or law enforcement people would say, well, we're going to overlook catching father in flagrante delicto with a young boy. We're going to overlook it for the good of the church. I was involved in a horrific legal battle that went on for years in Los Angeles, and it ended up in a settlement of $660 million. And it was an incredible fight, and the victims were like cannon fodder. And when asked why this thing dragged out as long as it did, why it was so destructive of the victims, the lead lawyer for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles said, we did it for the good of the church. And I won't, there's a two-word response to that, but I won't do it in this context. The good of the church really means the good of the bureaucracy. It's the good of the ecclesiastical aristocracy. Now, some bishops have admitted this in recent years, and they've admitted when they've been put on the hot seat how wrong this has been. to make this the primary value, that it has been an intentional mistake. By intentional, I mean they knew what they were doing. They had to know what they were doing when they were sacrificing the lives and the souls of these victims and their families, all the collateral damage, for the protection of the church, because of the misplaced belief that the institutional church is essential for the salvation of those who are members. That's us. That we need the seven sacraments, we need the bishops, and we need the clergy to survive, to make it to the next life. And then you say, well, what about the 58 billion people that existed before Jesus Christ came on the scene? What happened to them? Are they back in limbo, which was closed a few years ago? Or, are they in some version of limbo or what? Well, if you have a brain that works, you know that all the ritual, all of that is nice. It's not crucial. It's what's in your heart and how you live your life. That's what's important. So to believe that we need the rituals, that we need the bishops, and we need the clergy to make it from this existence to the next is fallacious. However, that is the root of the value. God bless him, Archbishop Dennis Hart, who's retired Archbishop of Melbourne in Australia, testified publicly before the Royal Commission, and I believe 2015 or 2016, and he said exactly this: that we've been wrong. We've placed the church, the institution, as the central value, and that has been wrong. We can't do that anymore. He said it publicly, and so that has gone down. Now others have said the same thing, but I look back on my years, and I can tell you that I can probably I know I can count on one hand the number of bishops and above who have stood up and publicly supported the victims and publicly defended them and publicly acknowledged the harm that had been done to them. On one hand, that's not too many fingers on one hand. I still have five, and there are, we're talking about several thousand bishops. Why can't this be done? What are they afraid of? Several years ago, one of our own bishops in the United States, named Thomas Gumbleton, who's a wonderful man. He's like probably 90 years old now. He's a great guy. But he stood publicly before the Senate in the state of Ohio and publicly supported and called for changes in legislation to help the victims of sexual abuse. And this change would have enabled more people to go to court and obviously sue the institution, because it's the only way they're going to get their attention. Within 3 weeks, he received a letter from the Sacred Congregation of Bishops, removing him as an auxiliary bishop of Detroit, removing him as a pastor from the parish in the inner city where he had been for 25 or 30 years. And he showed me the letter, and he said, they told me that the reason was because I broke communio with my brother bishops. And I looked at him and I said, Tom, thank God you did that. Because that meant, you're probably the only validly consecrated one in the country, because if adherence to the gospel is one of the key requirements to be a bishop, you got it. I don't know about the rest, but you got it, that's for sure. So that is a problem. Now, this scourge has been enabled by some core theological teachings that are essential supports for the ecclesiastical government, for what we know as the Catholic culture. Now, these issues in themselves are not bad, but they become exaggerated, they become distorted, and so they enable and they support and they protect those who want to violate children. Now, let me just backtrack a little bit. One of the things that I was trained in, and that is a primary interest of mine, has been medieval law, medieval church law. And so for the past 25 or 30 years, I've been digging into that because I want to find someday, before I am totally senile, an answer to why this has happened, why this keeps happening. And so I've been digging, and I began collaborating, thank God, with a woman, a medievalist, a couple of years ago, who did some incredible research into old church documents from the 3rd and 4th centuries. I mean, these had never been looked at before. So what I saw when I saw the results of her research, and she published a book called The Corrupter of Boys, was a straight line, an unbroken line between that period, that very primitive period in our history, and today. Because the values then, or the elements then, at that time that justified or encouraged this nightmare still exist. They have not been put out of business. And it's like a long black line that has gone through the church. Because every time the issue of sexual abuse rears its head, becomes publicly known, comes out of the shadows, the institution tries in its own way to control it, to punish the offenders, they don't do anything for the victims. There's very little evidence of anything ever been done for the victims to help them, but a lot about the punishments they've done for the clerics who've offended them. But nobody has looked and deeply studied the system. What are the systemic causes? This problem is rooted in an entire ecclesiastical system, a culture, a way of life. That's where it is. The sexual abuse of children and of adults is not, as the bishops on our country used to say, a few bad apples in the barrel. No, it's the barrel. That's where the problem is. It's not the apples, it's the barrel. So let's take a look at some of these. And the first one, I think, is the unrealistic and erroneous belief as to what a priest and a bishop is. The unreal idea that we, they, us, are exalted, sacred beings. We're entitled to deference because we speak directly to God, or they speak directly to God. And they are entitled to complete obedience because whatever they say is coming out of God's mouth to their head and through their head to you. Now, this is a myth. I mean, I think many of us sitting here today, the audience and those of us who are part of the organization, can remember back the way we were raised. When a priest came in, you'd stand up, salute, do all this, and that they were sacred. You know, you never questioned them, you never lied, you never hurt them, you never did anything. You believed everything they said because they were in the middle between God and us. And many, many of the victims, that's one of the reasons they were so frozen, paralyzed when the sexual abuse happened. That's one of the reasons why they really didn't know what was going on when they were being seduced and groomed for this sexual abuse. Because a priest would never do this. You couldn't even conceive of this happening. You couldn't process it in your brain. And I recall I was a kid in the 50s. I was in high school in the 50s and 60s. Hate to admit it, but I was. This idea, when we were in 7th, 8th, 9th grade, we couldn't even process it. That a priest would do this. It didn't exist. Well, that's a different world. But that way of thinking is still in existence. It still paralyzes a lot of people. So that's the one thing, the unrealistic idea that priests and bishops are exalted sacred beings and somehow or other can get away with doing this. Pope John Paul II resurrected an old teaching about the nature of the priesthood that actually grew up in the 16th century France, when referred to priests as men who were ontologically changed at ordination. Now that is something that has been used to fortify the position, and now the sagging position, the sagging image of a priest. Well, we're ontologically changed. The bishop ordains us, we walk out of the church, we're different beings. Now, philosophically, that in itself doesn't make a lot of sense, because if your ontos has changed, your being has changed. So you don't walk out as a human being anymore. You're a priest. Well, aren't you still a human? Well, no, we're priests. Okay. Let's not argue the point. But the best explanation of that I got from the late Bishop Jeff Robinson, who was another one of my heroes, an Australian bishop who also spoke up, stood up for the victims. And he was over here in a speaking tour, and I was having lunch with him in San Diego with Richard Sipe. And I'm sure many of you know who Richard Sipe is, or was rather. And we got to talking, and I said, Jeff, what does this ontological change? Can you define it for me? I mean, I'm not an idiot. I've got a bunch of advanced degrees, but you're a bishop, and you bishops are supposed to know everything. So what do you think it means? And he said, Tom, in his Australian accent, it's nothing more than ecclesiastical gibberish. Best explanation you can give to it. It is gibberish. It's just something to fortify the fact that we are somehow some special. Jesus Christ was not an ordained priest. They call him the high priest, but he was never ordained. But that, of course, is kind of an insult to the vast majority of the people in the church who aren't priests. So we've got that problem. And that problem, this misconception of the clergy, of the priest, as the essence of the church. We can't have the church without bishops and priests. Well, we can. We can have a church. The church is the people of God. All you need is a few people that believe and are trying to be decent with each other. And the analogy I always give that proves that it can be done. I'm sure all of you have heard of Alcoholics Anonymous. Everybody out there heard of that? Well, Alcoholics Anonymous operates probably the way the very primitive church did. It's gatherings of men and women who are deeply hurting, who are gathering to support each other. The AA does not have property. It doesn't have money. It doesn't have buildings. It doesn't have a clergy. It doesn't have priests, bishops, or a pope. It has only the spirit that we're here to help one another. And that we never condemn. Someone falls, we help them up. And I'm wondering oftentimes, maybe that's what it was like in the primitive church. Before they had all kinds of theology and canon law and all that rigmarole. Before there was an aristocracy, when everybody was pretty much on the same plane. Somebody was hurting, you reach out and help them. So that's one erroneous belief that's got to be changed. It's this aristocracy in the church called the clergy. We all know what clericalism is. It's an ism, it's a disease, it's a virus the Catholic Church has, which means the clergy and the clerical way of life and its values come before anything else. That's totally nonsense. Now, the other part of the myth is that the institutional church, and I've gotten into this a bit, has to be protected at all costs. And that the bishops, who are its essence, because God created it that way, and it's essential for salvation. Well, there's no evidence anywhere, scriptural, theological, archaeological, that Jesus Christ ever created a church or wanted to. We all remember Hans Küng, a wonderful theologian. He wrote a book on the history of the church, and he said it very, very clearly. There's no evidence that Christ ever created a church or wanted a church, even knew what a church was. But he was talking about something deeper than an organization, people getting along with each other, the way they handle each other. So the institutional church, this club, this organization, has to be protected at all costs, because in the church, we have the 7 sacraments, which are crucial for salvation. And who run the 7 sacraments? The clergy. They're the ones that are the ministers. They decide who gets the sacraments, who doesn't get the sacraments. They decide who gets absolution, who doesn't. In marriage, the husband and wife are the ministers of the sacrament, but it's got to be witnessed officially by a priest or a bishop or a deacon. So they get their fingers in everything. So that's another, I think, myth, that you have to have these, and these are in not the owners of the sacraments, but the caretakers are the clergy. We have to work through them to make it to salvation. So that's myth number 2. The final one I want to talk about is the constant, toxic, and erroneous teaching about the nature of human sexuality and the bizarre moral trappings that are attached to sexual behavior. The ideal, at least that's the way it used to be understood, was the celibate life. It's the higher way to go. It's the higher road. It's a higher calling than the non-celibate life, than husbands and wives. Well, husbands and wives, seems to me in some ways you got to be more Christ-like to be a husband and a wife and a parent than you do to be a priest, because you need to learn what it means to be unselfish constantly. Get up in the middle of the night, take care of sick kids, put up with your kids when they make mistakes, bail them out of jail, do all of those things. That's pretty crucial. And that's the kind of thing that's what marriage is. I mean, that's what even non-married people who are in a relationship. So I think the erroneous teaching about human sexuality has been so bizarre and has been so toxic for so many people. One of the offshoots of that is the clergy. Many of them have claimed they really don't understand what sexual abuse is. They think it's limited to some form of penetration. And they also think that and this has actually been said, that there are some that think that the young victims have themselves by being street smart and have tried to seduce the violators who are very innocent and childlike and don't know anything about it. That's just part of the problem with the bizarre nature of sexuality and where it plays into this. A lot of victims that I've talked to, when they were sexually violated as children, let's say just before or just after puberty, I remember vividly one young girl. She was 13 when she was raped by a Jesuit priest in Alaska, and she said, "I didn't even know what was happening. I did not know what he was doing. I knew it felt wrong, but I didn't know the words. I didn't know the vocabulary. I was very unsophisticated, not very well educated. So I did not know what was happening." And then when some of these young people do figure it out, they believe that since they're taught that priests don't sin and don't do sex, that it's their fault. I'm the one that bears the guilt for whatever he did wrong. And why is God doing this to me? I've always tried to be good. Can you imagine a little 12 or 13-year-old kid carrying that burden of guilt, that they're being punished by the Almighty for something they don't even know what they're being punished for? But they feel that way because of the way they had been taught. But the priesthood coupled with this crazy idea of human sexuality. And then I just want to say that, that has to be somehow or other changed. The whole concept of a lot of people say, well, it's because of celibacy, that's why this is going on. No, it's not. Celibacy doesn't help. But it's not just the fact that there are men in the church and women in the church who don't get married, who lead supposedly chaste lives. That's not the point. The point is the attitude, the mystique about celibates, the way that they're prepared, the way they're raised, and it's very sterile. As Dick Sipe used to say, homosocial environment, just our own kind, men or women, if it's nuns. And so you're taught that anything sexual is a sin. Anything, even talking about it, can be a sin. It's part of human nature. And that's something we cannot get away from. So the way the church has responded and has been forced to change by their supporters, by the courts, by the clergy, and lay believers who get it. That's the way that change has been happening, by these people who have been challenging. And practically it's been forcing out of the archives of the institution, the records, the files, the documents that reveal what's really going on, that reveal the way of thinking, the attitudes, the philosophy that has caused this nightmare to keep galloping, at least in our lifetime and for centuries and centuries before us. The system, however, is essentially the same. Words of apology won't cut it. That doesn't do it. It never has, it never will. The institution believes that somehow or other, if you say something, it becomes real. Well, that's not true. They've been saying, the big shots have been saying, we're sorry about this. We have to do everything we can to help the victims. They've been saying that since it was all uncovered 25, 30 years ago, when they realized that they were now on the defensive and are going to stay on the defensive because there's a lot of power in the victims themselves, their supporters, and people like yourselves. Sexual dysfunction is universal. It's not endemic to geography, to race, or to religion. The Catholic Church's toxic response has been the same in every country where the church is established. The response has been the same. There's still plenty of pushback going on, of resistance to actually treating the victims, most of them are adults now, and not only the victims who were victimized as children, but the men and women who were victimized as adults. And we often say that they were vulnerable. Well, maybe they weren't vulnerable. Maybe they're just normal human beings who were mystified and bamboozled by the power imbalance, taught that it's okay. This is our secret. It's okay for me to take advantage of you because I'm a priest and that's what God wants, or some nonsense of that nature. And there's been some excellent research done on that dimension of it. But that's another part. Unfortunately, the sexual abuse of children has been so horrific, and I won't go into stories because they make everybody sick. But it's been so horrific, so horrendous over the centuries, what we've known, what we've uncovered. And statistically, we've only known that about 37% of those who were violated have ever come forward, have ever revealed what has happened to them. So you have the majority are still out there. They're suffering. They're in cocoons of guilt, of shame, of fear, of silence, and they can't get out of them. And many of these people, it takes 20 to 30 years to even get the courage up to come forth and say something, to speak. And that's why it keeps going. And there's generations. It's just going to keep going and it's not going to stop. So what do we do? First thing, it demands action and not rhetoric. Stop tolerating a clericalized church. Challenge when you see it happening. Challenge the hierarchy. There's no reason why we have to speak to these men with our hats in our hands, thinking that we're on an uneven playing field. We're not. We are the same as they are. They went through a ceremony and wore a bunch of robes, but they are the same as we are because we are all baptized and created by the same God. Above all, be compassionate and understanding to victims. That goes without saying. That I think of the one thing, the element of Christ that's in this whole thing. It's the compassion and the care for the victims, because they're the ones who are rejected by the institution. They're the ones who, if we did not force them, if there wasn't force from the courts, from an angry laity, and from angry victims who have come out of their shells to do this, we'd still today be back in 1950. We'd still be shuffling victims aside, not believing them, telling them they're wrong, telling them it's a sin to challenge the church, it's a sin to hurt a priest, all that stuff. So we have to wake up and we have to accept the fact that this issue will not change until the system that created it and sustains it is changed. And it has to change not just peripherally, not just with the trappings on the outside, but it has to change in its very essence, And I think we've got to begin thinking in those terms and acting in those terms, because the violation of the most innocent in the church, whether they're children or adults, the most innocent it's a scourge that neutralizes everything that's Christian about Catholicism. And with that, I am going to stop talking. And I understand I'm supposed to, if there's questions, if there's time. Once again, I want to say thank you to all of you for inviting me to be part of this. As I said, I'm especially proud to be sitting here talking to you because of my my great love of Scotland. And I've even eaten haggis, believe it or not. And there's not many on my side of the ocean that could say that, but I have.
I suppose this is the point, Tom, at which I'm brave and say, even as a Scotsman here, I don't really like haggis. But thank you very much for your time with us tonight, your witness, and perhaps, you know, if I can say, even the challenge, the necessary challenge that you've presented. The comments and actually even just the discussion within the chat area as you've been speaking has been really rich tonight, Tom. And I can see from that discussion that you have definitely started some quite deep thinking there. And I've tried, as they've been coming in, and please do continue to share your questions in the chat, but I've tried to pick out those that are maybe specific questions that I could put to you. And if I can take just the first one I have here, it says, could you please talk about the role that blackmail plays in the secret culture of clergy sexual activity and misconduct? How much of a role does this play in corruption, inaction, secondary deviance and normalisation of this misconduct and cover-up, and therefore further abuse?
Well, I think it's an excellent question, and it's very insightful, because the issue of secrecy has permeated, it was a major part of the institutional church, has been for centuries. And there's a paranoia, I think, that goes with being part of the clergy. We've always, you know, I was in it for a long time, felt that it's us against them. But the issue of secrecy has been used by perpetrators and by the bishops constantly to cover up, to keep it secret, to make sure that the world didn't know what was really going on. Now, there's two things that have started to break that down. One have been the courts themselves. In the United States, and I have to say, we have been the leaders in this country, because we were the first one where the first explosion took place, the leaders in breaking through the barriers. And we've done that by challenging the church's insistence that all their documents, all their information is privileged and has to remain hidden. Well, we've challenged that successfully, and time again now the judges say, no, it's not. Turn it over. So that's one thing that's really been extremely helpful, and it continues to be helpful, because the main forum where the changes have been taking place, where the progress is being made, has been in the civil courts, because that's one source of power that the church can't control. If they could, you and I wouldn't even be talking today, but they can't. But the other thing that's been rather miraculous is that the Pope Francis issued an edict in 2019 removing what we call pontifical secrecy from anything to do with any sexual abuse or sexual violation issues, whether it's with adults or children or whatever. That's kaput, it's gone. So they can't use that as a playing card at all anymore. This is under pontifical secrecy. Well, the pontifical secrecy it's been unshrouded. So those two things have started to make a difference, but the secrecy, it's deeply, deeply rooted. It's part of the culture. And it's part of the culture that doesn't need to be there, because what that secrecy has done, it's created a kind of a dual personality. So we present, the clergy presents itself as one being, one with one kind of attitude, we're one type of person. And in reality, the secrecy covers up what can be, a real rat's nest. So that's something that not only with the sexual issues, but with just about everything in the church is shrouded in secrecy. It doesn't need to be. There's no reason why they can't have live coverage at a papal conclave, watching these guys vote for the Pope. No reason. There's nothing, what goes on in there? They just go through a ceremony, they put a thing on a dish, and then they count the votes. Why not make it open like it should be? I don't know if that's a decent enough answer or not, but
I want to stick with the notion of secrecy, Tom. I want to stick with that question, because the next question asks if you might speak about the sacrament of reconciliation with its emphasis on secrecy and confessing to the priest and God, and not on reconciling with the victim Do you think that this is a contributing factor to abuse?
That's one that I've given some thought to it, and I think it can be a problem. It's a problem when victims believe that they have sinned in some way or other and have to go to confession because they've been sexually violated by a priest, and that's happened a lot. The secrecy that covers the sacrament of confession, I don't think we're going to see that go away, but the fact remains is that the priests who hear the confessions, they're obliged to keep secret, but they can tell people that come in and say, well, I was raped by a priest. You know, the last thing you want to do if you're a priest hearing confession is say, well, keep that secret forever. You tell them to go and reveal it to somebody. But I'm not sure if I totally understood the import of the question. I mean, the sacrament of reconciliation is part of a far bigger problem. The secrecy that it's used as a way to hide and to avoid accountability. That's the problem I have with that.
I want to then turn to the questions of accountability and look at this question here, which says that exceptions to power-led bishops, the questioner suggests, might include the Brazilian bishops who have supported the people wholeheartedly in their campaigns for social justice. Would you comment on where you see those exceptions and perhaps those signs for hope amid the episcopacy?
I think they're certainly, and I'm aware of not everything, but a good deal of what you're speaking of. There are signs of hope. There are here and there are bishops that are breaking out of the control that the groupthink has had on them and speaking out publicly about what's in their heart, what they think, what they really believe. That's a sign of hope. If it's more than one or two, there are significant numbers. And that may change. It'll be a long process, but it may change the culture of the worldwide episcopacy. And that's different in every continent, in every country. You go to like what we used to call mission countries, the bishops' thinking and their acting in those places is a lot different than what it is in the developed world. But I do see, I think, signs of hope, but I'm impatient. I've been dealing with victims of sexual abuse almost exclusively for 37 years, and I got to say that I'm sick and tired of the nonsense and the baloney we still get from a lot of the bishops. Excuses why it's happened, all the good that they're trying to do to make it. They're not doing anything. We're forcing them to do stuff. That's what's happening. So I have to admit that I don't have a great deal of patience in that regard.
I wonder, Tom, just before I move on to the next question, the person who asked our first question has come back in to say that they were perhaps asking more specifically about the actual reality of blackmail and how often that happens. Do you have a thought on that?
Blackmail?
Yes.
What I've seen, and I think you could call it blackmail, is perpetrators threatening their victims. If you tell anyone something bad is going to happen to you, I'll get even with you. God will get even with you. And if they're young victims and they believe all that stuff, that's terrifying. Or saying if you disclose this, not only you're in danger, but your parents and your friends as well. Is that the kind of issue you're referring to?
Yeah, and I think, within the chat, another example that came up might be the example of non-disclosure agreements as well. And again, the idea that, I'm just reading the comment here, when an abuser gets found out, they turn around and say to the cleric who found out that they will expose their abuses if they reveal theirs.
Now I know exactly what you're saying. We no longer allow non-disclosure agreements in the United States. I've encouraged a number of people that I've met who've had them to break them. I said, just break them. If they come after you, we'll get you the best lawyers there are to make them look like fools for coming after you. But we no longer, when the bishops met in Dallas here, in 2002, they ruled out secrecy, the non-disclosure agreements, the secret agreements, the secret contracts between them, and the secret settlements. That was all eliminated, but it still happens. Now, I know it happens in other countries as well. My advice to anyone who's in any form of litigation, if the church's lawyers tell you, we will only continue this if you give us a promise of non-disclosure, of absolute secrecy, get up and walk out. And get another, go in there with, and then don't honor it. Do not honor it. It's immoral and it is blackmail. And the reason is obvious. We don't want to let the world know how corrupt the outfit really is.
If I could turn to a series of questions that came in earlier on this evening about the notion of seminary training and formation. We're told that seminary training is changed beyond recognition and is creating emotionally and intellectually mature men. Do you think that's true, Tom?
Did you say creating emotionally and intellectually immature?
Mature, the questioner has said.
I can't give a good answer to that, but I can say this, that I don't have a lot of dealings with the clergy anymore at all. But I am stunned by some of the younger ones that are coming out, these ultra-conservative young men who want to walk around with all the vestments of the 1950s and say the Latin Mass and do all that. It's a kind of a romanticism, and I've had some conversations, not many, where they firmly believe in this idea that once they're ordained, they're sacred beings, that they're radically different. They believe in the mythology, and that, of course, is at the root of we're better than you are, and we can do what we want, and we're above accountability. I don't, over in the United States at least, I don't know what's going on in seminaries. But what I have seen, the results of some of them, I find discouraging, to say the least. And some of these younger men coming out, I found them to be terrifying in the sense that, they're so doctrinaire, they're so convinced, and completely lacking in what real pastoral work and attention really is about. So I can't give an intelligent answer to that except beyond that experience.
I'm curious though, just on that point and in line with one of the other questions we've received, do you think that is a product of those who are responsible for the formation? The questioners suggesting how many of the seminary professors and teachers that populate the seminaries, how many of them fit that conservative agenda?
All of them, because that's where these guys come from. I mean, they go into these seminaries and they're brought into this old clerical culture. It's not unusual over here to see young men walking around on the streets in cassocks or religious habits, and that this is 2022. And that those days are sort of gone, but you see that. I'm not saying every seminary, but the ones that I've seen, and it's limited, the faculty are the ones that form these men, that feed these ideas. As far as real critical thinking, I don't think it's something that's on the agenda. I would ask how many of them have ever read anything that Hans Kung has written, or any of the Vatican II theologians. And I asked this one young man, he said, "But why? Hans Kung's a heretic. He's not even a Catholic." Oh yeah? Well, Hans Kung was one of the greatest theologians, I think, to walk the earth. And he had a very clear understanding and vision of what church was all about, and he lived it. I asked him personally one day, I had a conversation with him several years ago, and I said, how do you maintain any kind of spirituality given the pushback you constantly receive, the criticism from the hierarchy? And he said, I keep a positive attitude because I always have said that the center of everything in my life is Jesus Christ. Pretty simple, but true.
Tom, I'm really conscious of time for questions, but I wonder if I can maybe take a few questions together and put them to you, focused around the notion of, can the system change? Do you have hope for the future of the church? And do you think that the synod presents any meaningful way forward? And then lastly, within this notion of moving forward, do you think that there is a need for a public penance from the church? And what do you think that should be?
The synod, I followed that not really closely, because as I said, I'm old enough to have seen a lot of different things over the years, a lot of buzzwords and a lot of talk, a lot of new programs, policies, a lot of new, we'll do this, we'll do that. I think it's going to be something more radical. It's got to be something much more radical that changes from the inside out. Enough of them to say, hey, we're going to stop all this clericalism. We're going to stop this. We got to stop this, because that's where the root is. It's not synodality. It's not. I don't even know what the word means, but I think it's deeper than that. And I believe if the Catholic Church started, and if it could do some of the things it's done through history, and still survived, and still there's an essence of goodness and kindness and love there, I think that the changes that we want to see happen can happen, and they are happening. I look back 37 years, and I look back and I think, looking back to then, I never in my wildest dreams would have thought I would see what this whole nightmare has developed into as a very positive force. The victims and the way they banded together, and the supporters, and the catalyst for realization that there's a lot more that needs to be fixed, has been a major change in the history of the church. It's changing, it's turning. It's not turning fast enough, but that's organizational behavior. I don't want to get into that, but I think, I don't know if I'll live to see what I'd like to see, but some of you may see some radical change. We've seen some, I think, already, but a lot more to go.
Tom, I'm conscious that we've run out of time for questions this evening, and I can only apologise to those that I didn't get to, because there were a plethora of fantastic, amazing, insightful questions within the chat. There is one, however, that I really do want to put to you as a final question, Tom, that's really struck me as it came in. It says this: what advice would you give to a wife whose husband has revealed that as a boy he was sexually abused by a cleric? He's still confused and wounded and very, very angry 40 years later, and the whole family's suffered.
That's a dynamic that is very, very common. It's horrific, but it's common. And my advice, let me just confess that I've seen in my own family. This has happened in my own family. It wasn't a priest that did it; it was two young men. But the point is that it's such a deep wound in so many parts of your being that you cannot survive it alone. And I would urge anyone, this woman and her husband, especially the husband, if he had gone through this, seek assistance, get competent assistance from someone who knows what they're doing, and to help him unpack psychologically the damage that has been done. And he, I've worked with a lot of victims with spiritual change. And some of them, it means, quite frankly, firing the God that they were led to believe is the God that's up there. Get rid of him. Start over again with another being, another power, a higher power that's not, the Yahweh thunderbolt, judgmental and everything else. But that kind of the dynamic you're talking about, it can destroy a family. It can destroy the couple. He needs support. He needs love. And he needs encouragement, but he needs outside help. That's a fact. There's no other way around it.
Tom, thank you so much for your talk tonight, for our conversation. I understand that we're now going to hear from Paul.
Okay. Yes, I'm a member of MACSS, which is Ministry and Clergy Sexual Abuse Survivors, and it's been going for some time. And perhaps Tom will remember speaking at one time at one of our conferences in Edinburgh. And Margaret Kennedy had set it up. It goes back a few years. But we are a group of survivors across denominations, I have to say, as well, not just the Catholic Church. And a lot of the things that Tom's talked about are very, very common. Yes, people coming forward after 50, in their 50s and 60s, never spoken before, very, very common. And what I think is being most helpful has been peer support, people hearing and listening to other people that have experienced the same.